Good evening. Good evening. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce the second of the Richard D. Cohen lectures, the newest of the lecture series at the Hutchins Center. I'm the newly appointed Assistant Professor of History of Art and Architecture and African American Studies. Yay! And I am on leave this year and back to Harvard's campus to start to find a home, a house that I can turn into a home, which is an activity not unrelated to introducing Professor Richard J. Powell, the scholar who's made a home for so many in the field by the power of his example and his curiosity and care for the discipline of the field. His lecture today on the African American reinvention of blackface minstrelsy is entitled The Minstrel Stain. Richard Powell is the Duke University Dean of the Humanities, Professor of African American Studies, and the John Spencer Bassett Professor of Art and Art History. He is one of the field's tireless stewards, serving as chair of Duke's Art and Art History Department from 1998 to 2001, while he was both an associate and a full professor, serving as the editor-in-chief from 2007 to 2010 of the Art Bulletin, the world's leading English language journal for art history. His work has earned him recognition from the 2013 Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American art history from the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art to the 2016 College Art Association's Most Distinguished Scholar Award, the same organization that's elected our own Suzanne Blier as president just today. She. But art historians have long known what these awards represent, which is that Professor Powell is truly the headwaters of the field of African American art history and visual culture. So if you'll picture me standing before you as just one of hundreds of scholars and curators and artists who's had their imagination and work shaped by Professor Powell, perhaps all genuflecting to him, you'll get a sense of the warmth of the crowds that accompany me in spirit as I offer him a short introduction of tribute today. Nearly 20 years ago, just a few months after I began my freshman year here at Harvard College, I received a book entitled Black Art and Culture in the 20th Century from an administrator in the then titled Afro-American Studies Department. At the time, Harvard had no art historian focused on Black culture and art history, and so I was busy trying to craft for myself a course of study. She saw how passionate I was about the field, and so she inscribed the book simply with great expectations. As many of you know, this is one of Richard Powell's books. It is one of his 4 books, 8 exhibition catalogs, and by my last count, over 71 essays and articles that you've produced over these decades on topics ranging from primitivism to postmodernism, with titles including landmark works such as Homecoming, The Art and Life of William H. Johnson, to Cutting a Figure, Fashioning Black Portraiture from 2008. What I valued so much about the introduction that the book offered me was the frame that it gave me about the capaciousness of the field of Black cultural production and the strategies that artists employed to produce knowledge and to question narratives. I will forever be grateful for the blessing of that gift, the foundation that it gave me for the field and the work that I do. I now know that it would be impossible to enter the field of African American art history without passing through the barreled archway that his scholarship represents. As a professor, it would be unthinkable to design a course on African American art history without his scholarship, like serving students a Swiss cheese version of the field, filled with holes, where probing insights about Black figuration and Black satire should be. How could you teach a course and not include one of Professor Powell's many curatorial contributions, including exhibitions on artists like David Hammons or Catherine Dunham or poet-activist Essex Hemphill, to name a few? All of these exhibitions have taken place around the US and some in Europe at institutions like Phillips Academy's Addison Gallery of American Art to LACMA or the New Orleans Museum of Art. Today, the field is abuzz with the discoveries of one of his most recent exhibitions, the stunning Archibald Motley Jazz Age Modernist show at the Whitney Museum. that began at the Nasher. It expands upon themes that are present in our own Cooper Gallery's exhibitions, The Art of Jazz, which is a stunning exhibition that we're so fortunate to have here. In an interview with Duke University professors Mark Anthony Neal, Professor Powell stated that he wanted to reframe our sense of the painter, Archibald Motley Jr., seeing him as less of a noble gentleman and more as a man in the thick of the action, as he said, who would go into the scenes that he would paint, then retreat to his studio to produce the masterworks that we now celebrate. It occurred to me that this description was an apt summary of Professor Powell himself, in the thick of the action, who then, too, retreats to his studio, he is also an artist, and office to produce the landmark scholarship that we celebrate. Now, there are a number of things I could go on to say about Professor Powell's landmark exhibitions and scholarship, yet yesterday, Professor Cheryl Finley offered a beautifully synoptic introduction of his career. So instead of replicating that, I thought I would leave you with what many of you might not know unless you've had the good fortune to work with him as I have. And that is to get a sense of his commitment to the development of the field. Consider this example. Some time ago, Professor Powell convened a workshop on diaspora African arts and Black aesthetics at Duke University. We've all been to fantastic workshops, and this was nothing short of a stellar experience. But it contained a unique feature. The presenters were not esteemed professors. They were 6 advanced graduate students that he selected, and I was fortunate to be among them. The audience was comprised of junior and senior faculty members from universities around the country, including editors from Duke University Press. We all presented chapters of our dissertation. I cannot overstate what an inspiration it was to those of us that were there to present, but in hindsight, I see it more now as a moving tribute to Professor Powell's commitment to the health and continuation of the field of African American art. And I'm pleased to say that all 6 of those presenters, including myself, have gone on to gainful employment and fantastic positions, including curatorial posts at Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture and Harvard University. In closing, I'd underscore that yesterday Professor Powell asked us, how does Black visual satire work? Why is it a topic worth exploring? And it occurred to me that this is a variant of the question that Professor Powell has put to countless scholars about the field in general. How does the field of Black cultural production work, and why is it worth exploring? His scholarships remind us, that is to say, about the stakes of the field, the expansive breadth of his object of study, pulling so much into the world, into its midst, from political satire to paintings, reminds us of the deep historical knowledge required to read culture today. And also reminds us that there's a level of visual literacy required for understanding our culture. It is, in short, scholarship that makes us understand not only the significance of a work of art, of movements, of different media, but makes us see the signal importance of the discipline of art history itself. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to Richard Powell.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Skip, I can kind of get used to this. I'm sorry. I'm enjoying it. I didn't do this yesterday, but let me just take a few minutes to just thank all of you. Harvard University, the Hutchins Center, the Cooper Gallery. This has been a really important opportunity and occasion for me. Not just being with friends and colleagues, but having an opportunity as a scholar to think deeply about a topic and to have a forum of fellow colleagues to engage and discuss. It sounds like it's not that big of a deal, but it's really, really important. And we don't have a lot of opportunities in African American art scholarship to do this. So I'm indebted. I'm grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Today's lecture is called The Minstrel Stain. And I have a little epigraph by Carol Walker. This is from a series of drawings that she did called Do You Like Cream in Your Coffee and Chocolate in Your Milk? But this particular image has the words attached to it. Demeaning portraits should be seen and not heard. In 1980, Robert Colescott painted a double portrait of one of the most beloved dance partners of Hollywood's golden age. But in the artist's characteristic way, Shirley Temple Black and Bill Robinson White posed an affront rather than an affirmation. Instead of the popular conception of a deferential but jovial old black man instructing a spirited little white girl in a complicated dance step, Colescott painted a lascivious, tongue-wagging Caucasian man ogling a blonde-haired, brown-skinned, prepubescent girl, her wide-eyed gaze brazenly meeting his amidst an excessive, simulated Arcadia. Robert Colescott's racial transpositions and allusions to African American subservience were by 1980 a curious, although occasionally explored, thematic strain in American art. These stereotypic characterizations and racial reversals, more symbolic than illusionistic, were in effect a dash of insult and betrayal from an earlier time, but couched in a satirical frame of mind that, given that earlier moment's heightened black consciousness and race pride, often felt strange and precipitously veering towards parody. This artistic impulse of the 1960s through the 1990s towards an incongruous, emblematic racial about-face and the insertion of stock racist characterizations of African Americans into pictorial narratives is the phenomena this lecture will investigate. Black visual satires in this period seemed especially interested in artistic strategies and personae that subscribed to these radical interventions. And it is my objective to make sense of these provocations in light of a cultural moment when both artists and audiences were invested in relatively straightforward, celebratory black images. The specter of 19th century and early 20th century blackface minstrelsy loomed large over these troubling artistic elements, and yet selected African American visual satirists like Robert Colescott and their other cohorts incorporated these irritants into works during the Black arts movement years and throughout the nascent postmodernist decades of the 1980s and the 1990s. Why artists chose to venture into these racially problematic territories when the culture's most insistent rallying cry was "Black is beautiful" is the question, along with how this minstrel stain captured the artistic imagination and embedded itself in that era's most iconic works. The early to mid-19th century performer of blackface, Thomas Dartmouth Rice, is widely referred to as the father of American minstrelsy. Dan Rice donned rags and cotton wig, adopted the most exaggerated gestures and broken English from enslaved and impoverished African Americans, and applied burnt cork and other colored pigments to his white skin in order to portray racial blackness and to perform his much admired jump Jim Crow routine. Before too long, the American stage was inundated by white entertainers in blackface, whose broad characterizations and distortions of black bodies and culture were staples of the American theater well into the 20th century. And perhaps not as well known was blackface minstrelsy's popularity outside of the US, attracting music hall audiences in England, continental Europe, and as far away as Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. Although blackface minstrelsy and its allusions to the institution of slavery and life in the southern United States were considered quintessentially American to foreign audiences, for many 19th century European blackface performers, these same acts reminded them of their own minstrels, the itinerant commedia dell'arte actors in Italy and France, whose costumed, masked, and heavily made up actors also trafficked in stock character types. The commedia dell'arte's characters that represented the zani, or the servants, tricksters, and other lowbrow types in early modern Europe, usually wore brown or black masks, and occasionally black or dark brown face paint. And conversely, the commedia dell'arte's most iconic and often tragic character, Pierrot, usually performed in pantomime and wore a loose-fitting white shirt, white baggy pantaloons, and a ghastly complexion derived from white face paint. This brief account of European and American performing art traditions that utilized face painting in black and white is key to understanding the modern and contemporary expressions of this theatrical practice, in that it indicated not so much an attempt to trick audiences into believing these characters were real or closely resembled actual people, but rather it indicated the actor's desire to theatrically and symbolically represent the racial, cultural, or social other. Operative in these aforementioned minstrel traditions is the 19th century aesthetician Samuel Taylor Coleridge's theory of suspended disbelief, where audiences overlook the limitations of theatrical illusionism so as to not interfere with the performance's dramaturgical propositions and the audience's acceptance of them. Comparable in a sense to the ritualized painted face and body decorations of many African peoples and of some Native Americans, these aforementioned minstrels embraced their painted personas with such a passion and personal sense of metamorphosis that despite the makeup's patent superficiality, they succeeded in conveying their audiences, they succeeded in convincing their audiences of their respective characters' assumed personality traits, whether pitiful, ludicrous, ferocious, or benign. The American minstrel tradition is also imbricated in advancing selected racial stereotypes, such as the wide-girthed and bossy mammy, the elderly and obsequious Uncle Tom, and the woolly-headed, almost feral in behavior, pickaninny. Blackface minstrels performed these popular roles for decades, and along with the countless literary and visual representations of these same racial distortions and cultural exaggerations, the sensory and psychological ramifications of these stereotypes made a permanent impression on the American psyche. In addition, the promotion of these racial stereotypes is not confined to white performers, writers, or visual artists. Indeed, African Americans too have embodied these same broad characterizations, although it is debatable whether black artists, as presumed cultural insiders, have transformed these stereotypes into less pernicious and more nuanced personae. The selected works of three Harlem Renaissance-era African-American artists, writer George S. Schuyler, sculptor Sargent Johnson, and painter Palmer C. Hayden, are some of the earliest examples of a return to minstrelsy in African-American art via the satirizing of the practices, discourses, and trappings of American racism. George S. Schuyler's 1931 novel, Black No More, playfully subtitled, Being an Account of the Strange and Wonderful Workings of Science in the Land of the Free, AD 1933-1940, is a stinging critique of racism in Jazz Age America, and of how racism was a highly profitable social commodity for those times. Schuyler's Black No More is the story of a scientist who invents a medical procedure that makes African Americans appear Caucasian, and as a result, ignites, via a dizzying array of subplots, a succession of interpersonal deceptions and far-fetched national conspiracies with disastrous and hilarious results. This satirical novel makes vivid how America's preoccupation with race in these years fueled subterfuges around racial hegemony, interracial sexuality, and even for the race men of that day, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, naked opportunism for socioeconomic ascent and political clout. Instead of the none too subtle channeling of minstrelsy's racial turnabouts that Schuyler explored in Black No More, Sergeant Johnson and Palmer Hayden took somewhat different artistic routes by prominently featuring Black subjects who easily aligned with recognizable racial stereotypes and stock Black characters. In the early 1930s, Sergeant Johnson created a series of sculptures, drawings, and prints, each featuring a domiciliary, full-figured Black woman flanked by small children. As Johnson's etching Divine Love suggests, the traditional Madonna theme in Western art has been substituted for a Black mammy, here sharing her largesse with two infants, one white and one Black. Johnson blurs in these works the Black mother's righteous selflessness with a constitutive, full-bodied servitude, and consequently disturbs the audience's preconceived notions of this cultural type in either direction. Palmer Hayden's 10th Cavalry Trooper operates in a similar, ambiguous, interpretive terrain. The titular subject, one of the Buffalo soldiers who served in racially segregated United States Army regiments, appears more like a caricature than an equestrian war hero. His black-faced, pink-lipped profile resembling the disembodied head of a Jolly Sambo mechanical bank. Nevertheless, Hayden's painting is an ironic eulogy for the 10th Cavalry, which around the same time the artist painted this canvas, was experiencing marked reductions in their numbers and significant structural changes to their celebrated military units. Hayden's cavalryman assumes a resolute, dutiful bearing in this pictorial send-up, with his fair lady faithfully appearing in the distance, and his carousel-like undersized steed exhaling cartoonish puffs of hot air. The artistic trade in racist imagery and in the conventions of blackface minstrelsy were not only present in the works of artists like Palmer Hayden, Sergeant Johnson, and George Schuyler. These same problematic elements and impulses were the staples of popular African American entertainment in the 20th century. Visitors to theaters and nightclubs that catered to Black audiences were exposed to African American comedians and other performers who acted a fool or engaged in hokum, the latter a mode of performance that, using a Southern Black American voice, a wry and acerbic sense of humor, and often a countrified, unfashionable demeanor, enlisted Black audiences in multi-layered call and response routines and playful banter around shared Black experiences. What these African American performers knew was that their off-color humor and critical insights into pre-civil rights era Black lives were especially explicable to Black audiences and accepted by them through the adoption of a disarming yet incisive minstrel mask, a persona whose symbolic alterity and faux camouflage allowed it to utter uncomfortable truths and bear witness to perceived injustices. By the mid-1960s, these racial subterfuges in pre-civil rights era Black America seemed tame, especially considering that decade's burgeoning rhetoric and concrete expressions of Black agency. In 1966, writer Leroy Jones encapsulated the necessity for a cultural realignment among African Americans, proclaiming, quote, "There will be some of us who will not be Negroes, who know that indeed we are something else, something stronger, that there are some of us who know we are Black people," end of quote. This call for a rehabilitated racial self-consciousness among African Americans, not only from Jones, but from a broad spectrum of Black intellectuals and activists, formed the ideological core of what will be called the Black arts movement, a cultural insurgency that, utilizing the literary, visual, and performing arts, placed Black people and their political conditions at the center of creative works. From cataclysmic scenes of revolutionary actions and violence to the pictorial details of articulated bodies, African faces, and halo-like natural hairstyles, the Black arts movement made Black sovereignty its narrative rationale, couched in an expressionistic Pan-African aesthetic. "We Black people know what our reality is," continued Jones. "Look out of your window or into your heart, and you know who we are, where you are. You know what you feel. You know what you have to do." Leroy Jones's directions and incitements to Black people in 1966 revealed his work of late in the theater, having recently produced several important off-Broadway plays, Dutchman in 1964 and The Slave in 1964, not long before establishing the Black Arts Repertory Theater. A recurring feature of these and other Black theatrical productions in the 1960s was, oddly enough, minstrelsy, or to be more precise, the introduction of racial stereotypes and the vestiges of blackface in contemporary plays, so as to satirically underscore by way of antithesis a radically different, revolutionary path for Black people. For example, in the 1965 short play Jello, Jones used the Old Jack Benny radio program and his repartee between Benny and his Black servant, Eddie Rochester Anderson, as the foundation for an ideological conversation, in stages turning the subservient rat-fester, Nee Rochester, into a marauding Black rebel. This artistic sleight of hand, that is, proclaiming one's Blackness and cultural ideational independence from a white power structure by satirically using some of the most egregious and racist emblems and tropes of the past, is not something that on the face of it can be easily understood. What transpired was a nuanced stratagem that gave the stereotype a new repertoire, one that included the assertion of a Black political agenda while simultaneously eviscerating the stereotype of its racist venom and one-dimensionality. The Black arts movement, summarized theater historian Mike Sell, appropriated and deployed blackface in a fashion that both purified its insurgent potential and disabled its role in the commodification and denigration of African Americans. Although the metamorphosis of slave-like subservient figures like Aunt Jemima into Black rebels during the Black arts movement years has been noted by countless art historians, the exact personas these stereotypes were changed into has not received close scrutiny, nor have the satirical projects that they served been sufficiently examined. Artist Jeff Donaldson's unconstrained Black woman in his 1963 Aunt Jemima and the Pillsbury Doughboy, for all of its artistic license in the implied battle between these two product icons, had real-life resonances in many of the published photographs from the spring 1963 race riots in Birmingham, Alabama. Donaldson's critique of not just American racism, but of capitalism's poisonous covenant with Madison Avenue was also present in Joe Overstreet's The New Jemima, and in Murray DePillar's Aunt Jemima and A People of the Sun, Uncle Remus. Three works of pop art envisaged with a decidedly African-American twist and in a droll, highly satirical manner. Artist Betty Saar's well-known assemblage, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, is arguably the more complex statement in this group, combining within a glass-fronted box the repeated image of Aunt Jemima from actual pancake boxes, ceramic and printed racist memorabilia, circa 1970s Afro kitsch, a miniature pistol and rifle, and the store-bought ingredients for making an incendiary projectile. Comparable in form and effect to a multi-segmented, confrontational, and prophylactic Nkisi and Kondi of Central Africa's Congo peoples, Saar's 1973 assemblage functioned similarly in that it did not so much proclaim freedom from the stereotype as it conjured an effigy that, via its marshaling of negative imagery and inflammatory elements, subverted the stereotype for alternative, revolutionary purposes. Two additional Jemimas also illustrate the extent to which some artists advanced the idea of rehabilitated stereotypes, but as evidenced in their unbridled satires and shocking narratives, they vaulted the moralizing tendencies of their artistic counterparts. In an especially scandalous drawing from entitled Jemima's Pancakes, Robert Colescott takes Donaldson's pairing of two product icons to the extreme, foregrounding a voluptuous Jemima and her tall pancake stack with a series of sexually explicit pictorial vignettes performed by her with Kentucky Fried Chicken's founder and brand icon, Colonel Harlan Sanders. Rather than a satirical jab at racial stereotypes in Madison Avenue, Colescott puts Aunt Jemima on an equal basis with Colonel Sanders, a statement of sexual and racial egalitarianism that was quite radical for the times. Another stereotype about face from this period was the 1972 film Georgia, Georgia, directed by Stig Borkman from a screenplay by Maya Angelou, about a temperamental black entertainer, Georgia Martin, played by Diana Sands, and her contentious relationship with other African Americans, her live-in maid, played by Minnie Gentry, and her inner demons. The film notoriously concluded with the mammy maid, who throughout the film routinely brushes the black diva's hair in unseemly bosomy sessions, murdering Georgia because of a notorious interracial fling, and immodestly restraining the entertainer between her open, clasping legs. Light years removed from Sergeant Johnson's all-embracing, ever-loving mammy, and Jeff Donaldson's self-defensive heroine, Maya Angelou's race-avenging Aunt Jemima harkens back to Ratfester in Leroy Jones's 1965 Jell-O, a convert from Uncle Tomatutisms and a black rebel whose destructive attributes, apart from the recently murdered Malcolm X and Robert Franklin Williams, civil rights activist and author of Negro and Guns, were virtually unheard of in the mid-1960s. In other words, there is this kind of insertion of these stereotypic figures who go beyond the pale. Also in 1965 was the off-Broadway premiere of the farcical Day of Absence, Douglas Turner Ward's reverse minstrel show with black actors in whiteface performing the roles of whites in a small southern town on a day when, perhaps channeling George Schuyler's Black No More, all of the town's blacks have mysteriously disappeared. The experience of seeing African American actors sporting clown-like white face paint and speaking in exaggerated Southern drawls was transformative for audiences, touching a sentient chord in them, and more importantly, inviting them into the satirical realm of burlesque, where such theatrics were welcomed and the play's intended targets, white racism and black complicity, were deemed censurable. Ward's Day of Absence had an especially important place in thinking about minstrelsy and its utility during the years of the Black Arts movement. Possibly inspired by the 1961 off-Broadway production The Blacks, French author Jean Genet's ritualistic masked play about white racism and black revenge, Day of Absence shared with Genet's The Blacks the Fanonian precept black skin, white mask as its epitaph, carried out in glaring racial parodies and role play between demarcated oppressors and the oppressed. The other common denominator between the two plays is the efficacy, or rather the tactical self-evidence, of the white mask for black actors or for black artists, and its ritualized hegemonic insignia, providing both its wearers and the audience with a scenario that reverses the power equation by shifting social worth and the dramaturgical objects of sympathy. Douglas Turner Ward's other source of inspiration for Day of Absence may have been one of the widely published photographs of Bobby Simmons, the Selma, Alabama teenager who, while participating in the legendary Selma to Montgomery March in the spring of 1965, covered his dark brown face with a pasty sunscreen and scraped the words "vote" onto his forehead. Like Day of Absence's white-faced black actors, Simmons' white mask was both parodic and symbolic, criticizing institutional racism while concurrently, and in all likelihood unintentionally, performing a work of body art in the manner of the French mime Jean-Charles Desbrosses Perrault. 1970 was a banner year for reverse minstrelsy in art. One of the most significant examples being Larry Rivers' I Like Olympia in blackface, a painted construction comprising two cutout standee canvas sculptures, inspired by Edward Manet's iconic Olympia, but one version with a black Olympia, a Caucasian servant, and a white cat added. It is worth noting that Rivers, who was already interested in social artifice in his work and issues of identity, both racial and ethnic, treated this dual presentation of Olympia, a commentary on race and desire that arguably lashed out at multiple sociosexual regimes, as a hybrid painting sculpture, which subliminally articulated the performative dimensions of his minstrel show, extending beyond the walls and encroaching into the audience's sphere. Filmgoers in 1970 were also presented with the black skin, white mask concept, due in no small part to increased chance-taking in Hollywood and a relaxing of the film industry's historic constraints on controversial subject matter. One of that year's most scandalous films, Brian De Palma's Hi, Mom, is a multi-thread satire comedy on youthful itineracy, personified in the lead character played by a 27-year-old Robert De Niro, set in New York City, and framed by that particular milieu's occurrences of amateur, i.e. adult, filmmaking, politics-inspired community theater, and domestic terrorism. The most memorable scenes in Hi, Mom draw attention to the two different forms of minstrelsy, blackface and whiteface. In the first instance, a white radical pornographic filmmaker, sympathetic to black causes, is accidentally filmed through his high-rise apartment window while in the act of painting his naked body black, including to the last hesitant brushstroke, his white penis. The second instance of minstrelsy in Hi, Mom is a black and white interlude that purportedly documents an evening of performance art entitled Be Black Baby. The sequence shows a black guerrilla theater troupe in whiteface, similar to Ward's black actors in Day of Absence, at first giving a group of white suburban theatergoers the artistic, authentic experience of being black, including covering their white faces with black grease paint and encouraging them to eat hog maws. But in due course, holding the audience hostage at gunpoint, robbing and beating them, and sexually assaulting one of the women in the group. Finally, the black actors step out of their menacing characters and announce that Be Black Baby has ended, to which the white suburbanites break out in applause, idiotically expressing thanks for a thrilling theater experience and for being shown how responsible they are for racism. The other filmic overture to minstrelsy in 1970 is Watermelon Man. Director and screenwriter Melvin Van Peebles' parable of Jeff Gerber, a white, middle-class insurance salesman who inexplicably wakes up black one day, much to his chagrin, and surprisingly, to the mixed reactions from family, friends, co-workers, and strangers. Van Peebles' casting of the dark-skinned actor, African-American actor, comedian Godfrey Cambridge as Jeff is crucial to the film's satire, making Cambridge's real-life blackness and his initial full-body cosmetic and wig transformation into a white man key to the audience's ability to grasp Van Peebles' intent and to understand American racism and its epidermalization of social value, beauty, and self-worth. The film's beginning, the white Jeff lying on a tanning bed and solitarily using exercise equipment, and the film's ending, shown here on to my immediate right, the black Jeff practicing martial arts in a tenement basement in concert with a spectrum of African-American men and boys, not only satirically juxtaposed a superficial, solitary desire for fitness with more resourceful collective actions for health and well-being, but framed Watermelon Man's racial metamorphosis in the context of the corporeal and progress towards a self-aware, culturally grounded, ready-for-battle modern black man. The creators of contemporary blackface, no matter how well-intended or racially or sympathetic the maskers might be, usually fail at making their audiences co-conspirators in the work's satirical, accusatory project. Setting aside for the moment satire's a priori locus in misapprehension, the pioneering postmodernist Cindy Sherman could not have assumed in 1976 that the public would have accepted the artistic worth of her Bus Rider series, in which her swarthy makeup and simulated African-American female personas essentially enacted a late 20th century version of the worst 19th century blackface performances imaginable. As with earlier blackface minstrels, Sherman's whiteness and his privilege made her assumed Africanity suspicious, and like subsequent explorers of an ideational blackness, from Nikki Lee, this is a Chinese artist, her 2001 hip-hop project, to Rachel Dozial's 2015 racial outing and excoriation by contemporary social media, neither the art label nor the kindred spirit defense give contemporary blackface a high-ranking station in the creative discourse and substantive discussion concerning race. But what if the artist is of African descent? And like artist Adrienne Piper, in her bitterly satirical and deadpan 1981 drawing, Self-Portrait Exaggerating My Negroid Features, she lays bare the perceptual fault lines of blackness, and consequently, the unreliability and capriciousness of human recognition and dissimilitude. Of course, it helps that Piper was well known in the art world, and that this cultural milieu was receptive to, and perhaps even fascinated by, Piper's racial plasticity. Beginning in the 1980s, many African-American artists forced audiences to deal with uncomfortable racial realities, and often adopting a satirical stance within these works, they troubled viewers' certitudes on the actual workings of race, and specifically blackness in the world. As a 1982 follow-up to his Shirley Temple Black and Bill Robinson White, Robert Colescott revisited In Listening to Amos and Andy, a satirical rumination on race and perception, not conceptually dissimilar from Adrian Piper's self-portrait. In Listening to Amos and Andy, Colescott uncovered the unexpected consequences of an auditory version of blackface, in which an African-American woman and her son exult in listening to two real-life white comedians, Freeman Godson and Charles Correll, impersonating African-American characters on the Amos and Andy radio program. Instead of solely targeting the denigrating aspects of blackface, Colescott revealed parallel worlds where white entertainers produced black stereotypes while black audiences found pleasure in their own reimaginings of those impersonations. The latter symbolized in the disembodied cigar-waving black hand extending from the depicted radio cabinet. That a vast gulf existed between Godson's and Correll's black mimicry and the average African American's will to fantasize seemed to be Colescott's main point, visualized in the painting's two atmospherically distinct, racially segregated circles of activity. Although the ironies of contemporary whiteface by African American artists were not entirely lost on audiences who encountered them during the Black Arts Movement years, mostly in the context of experimental black theater and in films like Hi Mom and Watermelon Man, subsequent examples of whiteface from the 1980s left many viewers confused and often hostile towards their implementers. When, in the fall of 1980, artist Howardina Pendell premiered her short video, Free, White, and 21, wearing a blonde wig, pale makeup, and sunglasses to represent a racially insensitive, arrogant white woman. The mainly white female and feminist crowd who saw Pendell's piece questioned the work's portrayal and challenged Pendell for her criticism. A similar satire audience disconnect transpired when an attempt was made in 1989 to publicly exhibit artist David Hammond's How You Like Me Now, a portrait of the black civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, but with blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin, opposite Washington, D.C.'s National Portrait Gallery. Unlike the rejection that Pendell's Free, White, and 21 experienced from her targeted white female gallery goers, Hammond's audience, Washington, D.C.'s mostly African-American public, was unaware that Hammond's was African-American, nor was the public armed with a cultural context that might have prepared them for his targeted denunciation via whiteface of institutions like the National Portrait Gallery. The negative reaction that How You Like Me Now generated from the black bystanders who witnessed its street installation, resulting in a skirmish with the artwork's installers, present company included, and its forced removal, was against the imagined perpetrators of this assumed erasure of Jackson, and not against Hammond's ironic but misunderstood criticism of institutional racism, captioned in spray paint with hip-hop artist Kool Moe Dee's 1987 browbeating anthem of the same title. Despite the mixed responses from audiences in the postmodern era to blackface, whiteface, and stereotypic black figures, their subliminal overtures to sexual transgression, characterized in the stigmata of blackness, or in the case of whiteface, its insinuations of racial genocide and cultural ideological impurity, offered fin de siècle black artists a menu of cultural touchstones that infused their work with a much sought-after satirical verve. Robert Colescott was an early diviner in this regard, using these minstrel stains to reveal racial fissures and sexual hypocrisies, and to criticize comparable regimes of apperception and desirability. One of Colescott's earliest and most explicit references to Aunt Jemima, "I gets a thrill too when I see de coup," encapsulates minstrelsy's psychological force on the heels of the Black Arts movement, while also foreshadowing the racial conundrums and visual cluster bombs artists like Adrian Piper, Howardina Pindell, and David Hammons will soon plant. Playfully quoting Willem de Kooning's 1950s Woman series and Mel Ramos's 1976 send-up of the same series, "I get a thrill too when I see de coup," made these prototypes the pictorial vehicles for venturing into satire's more hazardous, confusing terrains. By placing Aunt Jemima in a vortex of abstract gestures and disembodied white female appendages, Colescott interjected the notion of racial amalgamation into recent art history. And in tandem with this, Colescott paradoxically challenged the presumed superiority of white spectatorship, putting the painting's abstract expressionist brushstrokes and their allusions to more culturally fraught discolorations and stains in competition with and inside Aunt Jemima's wide-eyed, inclusive purview. That hiding behind Aunt Jemima and her inscrutable, grinning mask as an equally complicated flesh and blood black woman was a message proffered by several contemporary black women artists in the wake of Betty Saar and Maya Angelou's early 1970s art projects. Riffing off of Saar's emancipatory, revolutionary identity for Aunt Jemima, artist Renee Cox created The Liberation of Lady J and UB, in which a heightened black perspicacity is mixed with a critique of Madison Avenue and its racist compartmentalizing of black personas for profit. One can't help but take from Renee Cox's emancipating Rajay superwoman character here, along with the stereotype turned fashion models Roshumba and Rodney Charles, a parody of the idea of genuine black liberation, and that Lady J and UB have been traded for an upgraded and yet likewise absurd version of racial branding. Almost coincident with Renee Cox's digital spoofs were Beverly McKeever's painted self-portraits as a black-faced, fright wig-wearing, and house-coat-dressed clown, shown eating watermelon, engaging in common household tasks, and occasionally dancing and playfully wrestling with a half-naked white man. The innocuous, everyday situations in which McKeever located her Jemima-like alter ego, in contrast to Cox's media-informed, cartoonish settings, contributed to her paradoxical character, a both weird and familiar presence, whose pivotal place in these paintings, as framed by McKeever in luscious oil pigments on canvas, unsettled the assumed idiosyncrasy or revulsion such black female stereotypes typically convey. McKeever's couplings of this stirring black caricature with a white man broached America's deep-seated fears and fantasies about sexual liaisons between the races. But unlike the sex scenes in Robert Colescott's Jemima Pancakes, McKeever's interracial horseplay alluded to a kind of easy intimacy or a filial bond between the stereotype and whites that could be interpreted as more seditious than interracial sexual attraction. Similar artistic conceptualizations of the normality and the invisibility of minstrelsy and racial stereotypes in contemporary life and their role in formulating satirical statements against institutional racism and other targets have emerged since these aforementioned artworks. One example was artist Jefferson Pender's 2006 video installation, Juke. Consisting of 10 unamplified video monitors, Juke featured close-ups of 10 African American women and men filmed against stark white backgrounds and uniformly dressed in white t-shirts. As gallery goers donned each video monitor's attached headphones, they experienced each video monitor's respective black actor lip-syncing recordings of stereotypic white music, such as Loretta Lynn's Little Red Shoes, Johnny Cash's Mercy Seat, and Patti Smith's Rock and Roll Nigger, among other recordings. With each filmed black person's performance of whiteness, Pender's intended targets, gallery visitors contemplated their own racial and cultural presuppositions about racial identity and music. Another example of contemporary blackface in service to visual satire was when New York-based artist Jason Musson, circa 2010, adopted the character of the hip-hop doyen Hennessy Youngman for his mock series of YouTube primers on successfully navigating the contemporary art world. Here, Musson's parody seamlessly shifted between satirizing the alleged genius of vaunted hip-hop personalities and lampooning a hopelessly self-important art world. Like the black comedians from the Chitlin circuit era who performed in front of black audiences in an impecunious African-American clown mode, such as Jackie Moms Mabley and Dewey Pigmeat Markham, Musson's comic hip-hop masquerade minstrel show allowed him to criticize the often farcical world of hip-hop, and at the same time, to voice unfiltered, uncomfortable truths about the mercurial contemporary art scene and its awkward encounters with African-American artists and subject matter. Comparable in many ways to Robert Colescott's Listening to Amos and Andy, Jason Musson's Hennessy Youngman character and Jefferson Pender's Juke questioned cultural legibility and supposed racial essentialisms by setting conceptual booby traps in their respective artworks around race and class. One can see how early 21st century art audiences, in spite of an assumed visual literacy and some knowledge of social history, were either confused or offended by the Minstrel Stain and its constitutive disequilibrium, in which neither blacks nor whites are culturally privileged, visually idealized, or narratively grounded in a comfortable reality. For Jason Musson, Jefferson Pender, and Beverly McKeever, and other 21st century traffickers in these masked critiques, the only way the visual arts could ever approximate the labyrinthine implications of race and racism is through the hyperbolic, absurdist lens of a satire. It takes a bold person, writes novelist Paul Beatty about the black satirist, to buy a dime bag of absurdity. Carol Walker, the fin de siècle's most brazen absurdist and satirist, emerged during this same period as Robert Colescott's heir apparent. With her incisive critiques of racism, sexism, whitewashed histories, self-victimization, and every satirist's favorite target, moral hypocrisy. Walker's works on paper, her videos, and her art installations all employed the black stereotype as the most appropriate vehicle for astutely depicting, one, racism's psychological impact on human nature, and two, the instability of meaning as put forth in pictorial accounts and other discursive modes. Walker's silhouetted slaves and masters, rather than enacting the received narratives of black victimization and white brutality, upended these thrice-told tales with her own representations of abuse, profligacy, licentiousness, and cruelty perpetrated across the racial and sexual spectrum. In 2014, Carol Walker's musings and artistic powers all came to a crescendo with a 35 feet tall, 75 feet long, and 26 feet wide sculpture of a mammy sphinx made from gigantic blocks of processed white sugar. Entitled A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, an homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. Walker's massive art project, in collaboration with the New York-based art commissioning and presenting organization Creative Time, was one of the most important art events in the summer of 2014, employing a large crew of fabricators and installers and attracting thousands of art aficionados, tourists, celebrities, that's Beyonce up there, and curiosity seekers to its temporary makeshift exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Conceived in the hybrid human feline form and posture of an Egyptian sphinx, the main sculptural figure in a subtlety deviated from the ancient prototype with its pronounced African features, large buttocks, exposed female genitalia, and in the manner of a black southern U.S. mammy, a handkerchief-bound head. Surrounding the gigantic mammy sphinx and carefully dispersed throughout the deserted plant were 13 cast in sugar, covered in molasses, 5 feet tall, stylized sculptures of African boy servants, each posed in a stereotypic plantation job, carrying large baskets, toting clusters of bananas, etc. In contrast to the mammy sphinx's imposing mass and wholly original form, the 13 boy servants, with their caricatured anonymity, mottled brown surfaces, and allusions to mass-produced kitsch, exuded a fugitive, provisional impression, betraying in their molded forms their disintegrated, friable states, and in the end contributing to the work's titular allusions to being subtle, obscure, and fundamentally imponderable. Thinking about Carol Walker's none too modest a subtlety in the context of visual satire, the question that arises is whom, or exactly what, is this work's intended target of criticism? The sugar industry, we, the insatiable consumers of sweets, or the transatlantic slave trade and its dependence upon black and brown unpaid and overworked laborers? Perhaps, but one suspects that none of these aforementioned villains were Walker's true targets, and that she had more proximate objects in her satire's rifle scope. Carol Walker's more likely prey in a subtlety were her censors, the mostly faceless but outspoken arbiters of community decency, who occasionally obstructed the public's displays of her art, as well as the black cultural critics who, since she exploded onto the art scene in the mid-1990s, have disparaged her work and leveled personal attacks against her. In her Mammy Sphinx's most explicit, derriere-raised point of view, Walker communicated to her censors and critics alike to kiss her you-know-what, in a way not dissimilar from the corporeal taunts and comebacks that define a black female vernacular mode of signifying. And yet, like the previous examples of misrecognition towards satirical statements of art, a subtlety was itself visually lampooned upon its unveiling by hundreds of online mobile photo-sharing Instagram users, often for exhibitionist, obscene purposes. No matter how noble or celebratory in tone Walker's title for this work seemed, she certainly knew that in this postmodern moment of moral skepticism and collective distrust, a work of art in the public arena, especially a visually complicated one, would be subjected to not just serious criticism, but internet trolling and mockery. Walker's own playful edict, which served as his lecture's opening epigraph, demeaning portraits should be seen and not heard, along with her drawing of a mammy's head atop a ceramic figurine or a nesting doll, is perhaps the route for how audiences might best engage with such problematic, racist, and satirical images, pointedly, and yet without the assumption of the stereotype's misleading and ambiguous contexts, that it can be satisfactorily constrained, universally purposed, or thoroughly comprehended. In conceiving of her Mammy Sphinx, not enveloped in the colorful calico or a busy gingham, but rather in stark crystalline whiteness, Walker is perhaps reaching back several decades earlier, when radical Black artists like Robert Colescott developed a cadre of mechanisms for dealing with minstrelsy and the stereotype. Designs that, to paraphrase Mike Sell, connected the minstrel stain to a repertoire of insurgent representational and material discursive strategies that constructed a Blackness that was devilishly difficult to reify. Walker's subtlety was likewise a Black enigma, whose symbolic whiteness not only proclaimed for it an ironic allegiance to a Fanonian skin mask equation, but a satirical stance as well, where the dual messages of the stereotype's ghostly after effects and its incessant, often maddening, and invariably irrepressible dream work coexist. Thank you. Thank you. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you.
That's great, Rick. Questions, comments? Professor Jafo? Okay, later. You percolate. Questions, comments?
Claude, hey.
Within the context of your discussion of blackface, whiteface, I would like to propose an example or another example from popular culture that struck me a great deal when I moved to the United States from France, when I became a great fan of the original series Star Trek. There was one episode which I remember distinctly because the Enterprise was visiting a planet where the inhabitants were half black, half white. And one member was escaping the planet because he was the victim of extreme discrimination. And Kirk and Spock couldn't understand why, because everyone was white on one side and black on the other. But the dominant individuals in the culture said, yes, but he's black on the wrong side. Most of us are black on the left side and white on the right side, but he's white on the right side, or vice versa, I can't remember. But it would be an example of one of those modes of popular culture that in a very satirical way is poking fun and undermining racism, but including the black and white face together in a single image. I'd be interested to know how you would factor that into your discussion in terms of the history of the minstrelsy and, of course, the way in which popular culture provides an integral element in the whole span of images that you're showing us and putting in that context.
Thank you, Claude. That's a fascinating description of a Star Trek segment that I've never seen. But I'm particularly animated by it because this is a series from the late 60s, early 70s,
exactly.
in the same time period
Precisely.
as all of these images and examples that I'm showing you. And we all know that Star Trek, as a series, made an effort to kind of encapsulate in their scripts, narratives and plots that would kind of talk about these larger philosophical kind of issues. I remember watching Star Trek when I was a student at Morehouse, and one of my professors there was Luther Weems, who later on became Naim Akbar. He was very involved with the Nation of Islam and was one of those early pioneering psychologists interested in race and interested in the role of race in psychoanalysis and clinical studies. And I was always intrigued that he loved Star Trek and that he often would, after watching it, would come in and talk about these shows and the kinds of narratives that they wove, which he really felt had some real important things to say about America and psychology and how we interact with one another. And so I don't know if I can really answer your question other than I'm really, really intrigued with the idea that in this, actually this show uses paint a lot. It comes on MeTV in Durham, North Carolina, and I watch it on Saturday nights, you know, just to watch the reruns.
Just following up on that.
But there are a lot of people who always have kind of paint on their face, but I've never seen that one. So I would just beg you to just give me a chance to watch that whole segment.
And just to follow up on that, I also became, maybe I shouldn't admit this in a scholarly, intellectual, educational context, I became a fan of the second series, Star Trek The Next Generation.
Okay.
And I know that, or I heard that Whoopi Goldberg, when she heard they were making a new series, wanted to have a part written for her in the new series because she was so inspired in the original one that there was an officer who was black who was in charge of communications on the bridge. And she felt that was so empowering. That show was just so inspirational for her that when she heard there was a new one, she wanted a part, and she became one too.
Thank you.
Not at all.
I'm sorry I can't respond, but that is fascinating. I want to dig into that.
Yeah, and you know, I'm a Star Trek junkie. I never saw that episode.
I never saw it.
You saw it?
You've seen it? Okay.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Seen it. Okay.
All right, we're going to go home YouTube it. And that's, you know, the first, well, I don't know about the first interracial kiss, but members who kisses the captain, right? And that was a big deal.
And they dealt with other forms of interracial. I'm thinking of the Klingons,
interspecial.
The Klingons, and they would sometimes hook up with the people on the Starship
All
Enterprise.
kind of nasty kind of sex was going on in Star Trek. I like the fact that you included Harlequin.
Okay.
Because I wrote an essay once about the relationship between that black mask, and often he was represented with a black and white mask, and the two characters of the minstrel stage, Bones and Tambo.
Yes.
And I think that the mask just split off and became, you know, it was just popularized.
And of course, Harlequin is wearing black and white, or it's an outfit that is, back to what you just said, Claude, it's a split outfit that has patchwork on it, checkerboard, these patterns that implicitly, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow when we look at some Robert Colescott paintings, this is a kind of an emblem that speaks to, at least has been appropriated as a racial metaphor.
Well, and some of the Harlequin masks had, you know, ape-like features or monkey-like features or, you know, negroid features. You know, you don't have to be a genius to make the connection, right? So anyway, I love that. Questions, comments? Yes. I'm sorry, Cheryl. Then,
Carol.
No, Cheryl first.
Hello?
And then, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I looked right past Cheryl. I'm sorry.
No, sorry, I didn't know there was another mic. So then, I guess following up on the same line, there's a photograph by Hank Willis Thomas in collaboration with Sanford Biggers that you may know, entitled Crossroads, 2012. So this is an image, I don't know that anyone can really see it, it's on my phone. It's the image that accompanies a call for papers for the Black Portraitures 3 conference in Johannesburg this fall. And I guess the question I have, this is based off of a 19th century albumin print that Hank found in an archive. And so I'm curious, you know, again, thinking back to some of the prints and drawings from the 19th century, some of the more performative images from the 19th century, considering minstrel shows and that kind of genre, if there's something like this that you may have come across, and kind of not only thinking back to that memorable Star Trek episode, thank you, Claude, but also this image, or a version of it, Hank has done in a lenticular photograph, so the kind of...
Yeah.
Oh, you know it though, don't you? I thought you knew it, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
So the image is based off of a 19th century portrait that's just of a man standing, actually. He's standing, he has half black and half white, if you can kind of see. And in an earlier, there are a couple of different versions of this, but about a year or two ago at ICP, I guess it must have been maybe at least 2 or 3 years ago at ICP, which was then located in Midtown on 6th Avenue in the 40s, he had the corner window installation. And so you could go by and you'd see different versions of this image and kind of changing positions. But in the lenticular photograph, because it's a 2D image, but when you walk by it, it changes. So on one side, he's white, and then he turns to black. So I just thought I'd bring that to your attention if it might be something that you would consider.
It's really, really interesting. And I think it's the formalist side of me that is really preoccupied with how all of these artists literalize black and white. In other words, it's one thing to kind of reference race and to perform, particular kinds of perceptions or misperceptions of the other, but to transform the body by virtue of something as artificial as white paint or black paint, to me takes this into another realm. It raises the specter of an audience that will hopefully, or I'm assuming that the artist feels that there's some sort of collective understanding that we are now entering the symbolic world. But it's a symbolic world that nonetheless has its locus in reality. And to me, that's fascinating that our 19th century performers, are thinking about theatricality and performativity in such a way as to find a way to send a message through symbolism, and that we are continuing that narrative with, in this case, Sanford and Hank's project and all the other examples that I showed. It's really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I think there's one before me, right?
Oh, yeah.
Hey.
You have the microphone.
I have the mic. Okay.
Hey.
So thank you.
Yes.
I wanted, yesterday during your wonderful lecture, you said that black visual satire relies heavily on comedy, and today we were laughing at many of the images, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about humor, because to me, humor could be, us laughing could be one of two things. It could be that we get the satire, or that we're agreeing with the stereotype. And then and I wonder if you can discuss this in particular in relation to this Instagram photos of Kara Walker's work. Because the photos that you showed, my interpretation, it was very different when I saw those Instagram images. I looked at it as revealing racism that exists within the society, and you looked at it as mocking Kara Walker's piece, sort of making fun of her and what she was trying to do as an artist. I mean, are those two different things, two different interpretations? What is the role of humor? How do you interpret humor?
Yeah, humor. I mean, this is a project that has fascinated so many scholars and so many thinkers. I'm thinking about Bergson's, On Laughter, written, over 100 years ago, and he tries to grapple with how what makes people laugh, and there's a passage in that segment, and I'm probably misquoting it, but he talks about the absurdity, the hilarity of watching a person of African descent, dressed in kind of a coat and tails or something like that. And actually, if I quote him correctly, he's commenting on what somebody else has said as that which replicates or that which invokes humor. Humor does a lot of things. Sometimes humor is cringing. My wife is always hitting me upside my head when I laugh at things because she thinks I'm laughing at it because it's funny, but I'm really laughing because I'm really kind of, oh, wow, they went there. Ooh, it's kind of cringe humor, So, and I think that this is what's working with all these works. And Kara Walker, I have to say, is an artist who I think has realized, has discovered that she can push different buttons on people depending on who they are and where they are in the world. And perhaps in the context of Sugar Babies and how it got Instagrammed, to death in all sorts of ways, I can't help but feel she must have known that putting something out in the world like this, putting her work out in the world, not in an art gallery, but in a public space, that was the event that everybody went to in Brooklyn in the summer of 2014, that it was going to elicit many, many different kinds of responses. I'm sure there were people who knew nothing about the role of sugar in the transatlantic slave trade. She tried to communicate a little bit of that, through labels and what have you. Just like David Hammons tried to communicate through How You Like Me Now, that this portrait of Jesse Jackson is looking at a building where his portrait could not could not be there were it not for, again, the white paint and the blonde hair and the blue eyes. And one can smile at that. One can get mad with that. I mean, that's the kind of realm that satire kind of places us in. It's an unstable world. It's an uncomfortable ground. And I think that what has fascinated me so much about this project, again, is that artists willingly, knowingly move into a direction that is unstable and will sometimes invoke humor, sometimes will invoke anger. I mean, in some instances, it invokes physical altercation, and yet they do it because I think they realize the power within that object that they've created, and in the ideas that will be generated out of that.
Sarah and BJ, then we got it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. The question actually made me think of another one that I had, but I guess I would first say I see part of the contribution of this fantastic project as one that offers us a chance to look at what I guess Terry Smith might call the prehistories of contemporary art, right? Thinking about that from her Peace and Art Bulletin a few years back. And in this case, you're asking us to consider, I think, the prehistories of this feature of minstrelsy to do with the suspension required to look at these objects. And in that spirit, I just wondered whether or not a performance that's occupied my interest might come into your project too, and that is the Mask of Blackness. Do you know about it's not much, so in the 17th century in King James Court in 1608, he has a mask, a playlet, right, a performance, short play in which we have the first instance of blackface, right? In the English court, his consort, then queen, asks the playwright to essentially re-signify blackness on the cusp of sort of the new world being created, such that she and her ladies are painted in black as princesses from the continent of Africa, brought to Britannia to be cleansed of their blackness. And the next play is called The Mask of Beauty, which took place the next year because they couldn't scandalize the court by washing the women in front of everyone, so it took place on a subsequent day. And it's always occurred to me that play occupies a feature role in our discipline, right? And I wonder whether or not the suspension that the play's kind of incomplete ending, requiring the next play, The Mask of Beauty, to continue, is an inauguration of some of the liminality we're describing.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Sarah, because it brings back something that I tried to say a little bit about, and it's that we know what's underneath the paint. We know who that person is, really. And that kind of that allows us to kind of enter this world, this fantasy world, this play world and something as simple as paint, can allow the mind to kind of, do this journey, this sojourn to Africa, to a kind of a history, a narrative of conquest and power. And it allows the performers to, as you said, reappear, in this other mode. And and this is the West. This is a narrative of the West. How these performances can play out. And at the same time, we can then come back to doing what we do, which isn't necessarily all that glorious or celebratory or moral. Again, the role of the theater in this project that we're talking about is something that, again, as I was thinking about this, writing this over the past few months, it dawned on me how so central the stage and the power of the stage is in these kind of discursive modes.
Yes. I must say that I'm sure most people here, this was magisterial. It was incredible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such. In fact, that was why when Skip said BJ, I said later because I had to take it in, and I'm not even sure that the commentary I have is really well thought out because of the richness of the. But first of all, as you spoke, the question about humor. Actually, as you spoke, one text that came to my mind throughout is Freud. Jokes and their relationship to the unconscious. Yeah. So I think, I think almost everywhere, that text coming to my mind. But my more substantial question is your opening epigraph, which lays an emphasis on visuality at the expense, I would say, of the text, of what is written and what is read, poses a tension which I want you to sort of clarify a lot, because it seems to me that with the richness and the multi-genre, multimedia scope of your presentation, it seems to me that, and I may be wrong about this, because there seems to have been a division between a fairly stable regime of spectatorship in the period of the Black Arts movement, when the emphasis was on satirical inversion of the received image of minstrelsy, to the postmodern period when moral hypocrisy, makes that kind of, if you want, provisional certainty of the reception of spectatorship more problematic. I'm sure you've seen Marlon Riggs' Ethnic Notions, which has a sweeping review of the tradition. It seems to me that it's a tough act to sort of pin down the certainty of response, because I have used many of these texts in my classes. And sometimes I go to a class uncertain of what I will get, because sometimes they're so unpleasant, so bracing, that I lose it. I actually lose control as a teacher in the classroom. Other times it works. So there is no. So I was a bit intrigued by this division that you make between a more or less certainty that the satire will work, people will get it in the Black Arts movement, and that becomes somewhat more problem. I may have gotten it wrong, but this is my sense, So I'm saying that the richness of your presentation and the vastness of the media, of course, the emphasis was on the visual, but you dealt with films, with plays, and any number of the films and plays you mentioned, I can think of the kinds of struggles, interpretive struggles I've had to wage between which plays I actually cared for and liked, which ones I hated, So at any rate, as I said, these are preliminary observations.
Thank you so much for your comments. You've given me so much to think about and reflect on. I will say, though, that with my epigraph, nothing Carol Walker does is straight. She is playing with us. So when she says demeaning portraits should be seen and not heard, the reality is, in that whole series, she is throwing out words at us, and she's preaching to us. But they're false. They're words that throw us curveballs. Just as the images throw us curveballs. And yet your comments really make me want to kind of go back to this lecture and to think more deeply about the power of text versus the power of image, or how they conspire to drive us crazy. Back to Freud, I'm also intrigued with what you said about the 60s, let's say, versus the 90s, or the 60s versus the 80s, in the sense of Amiri Baraka and his plays, and and how that use of that material seemed to be understood within the context in which it was produced, versus the challenges that a Howardina Pendell might have had, or a David Hammons or a Carol Walker might have had towards the end of the 20th century. And And the irony there is that one might have assumed that at the end of the 20th century, we are much more visually literate. But the reality is that we're probably less literate because we're so inundated with all these images. It's hard for us to make sense of all the images that kind of come to us, via the internet, via, Twitter or Instagram, what have you. So I would say in some ways, this is a moment that is more of a challenge for us in terms of things that we think we understand but may in fact might not understand. Not that an earlier period was simpler. I don't want to kind of put that on the 60s and 70s as, oh, it was so obvious, because I'm pretty certain there were some people who were probably taken aback by Baraka's plays or yeah, and really didn't understand the subtlety of using these characters the way he used them. I don't know if I. Thank you for your comments. I have to chew on all of that. But thank you.
But there's never been a time in the history of satire parody, ever, when everyone agreed on the interpretation.
Yeah.
Some people, are the lion and some of the elephant, right?
Yeah.
And some of the monkey, right? Some people read things literally, some people read things figuratively. Yeah. In the same culture, the same age, the same gender, the same sexual orientation. That's what interpretation's about, floating signifiers, indeterminacy.
And Carol Walker's probably telling us that images are perhaps just as problematic and challenging for us to kind of make sense out of. I mean, text can be deceptive, but images really can throw us curveballs. And just as you saw earlier with my images by Sergeant Johnson, and particularly Sergeant Johnson, I mean, his women are all embracing, loving. But there's no question they also have this kind of rootedness in a Hattie McDaniels from Hollywood during that same time period. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to talk about this at any great length tomorrow, but Sergeant Johnson worked alongside Robert Colescott's father. They were both Pullman porters in California. And it's just worth noting that artist who did those images would become a model for Colescott as he moves through his career. But I'll talk more about that tomorrow.
Where's the Amos and Andy painting? The Colescott,
Who owns it?
Yeah, I want it.
I'll look it up for you. I'm
Okay.
not quite sure. I didn't put credits on all my slides. I apologize for that. But his works are all in good places because they're now really, people love him. He's so collectible and so important.
By the way, for those of you who don't know, all the lectures in the Cohen lecture series will be published by Yale University Press. And Richard Cohen, our good friend and patron, also said to me when he put up the money for the lecture series, I'll also pay for the cost for all the illustrations so that everything that you're seeing will be in Rick's brilliant book. But BJ said it best, magisterial. You're really knocking it out of the park, brother. This is great. Give it up for Rick Powell, please.
Thank you.